contains. And if it does contain it, we don't know if it was put there by people with an agenda who were making it up, right? And so on. So in the lower half of this one, it gets to this issue of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, I believe. There were two acts in the mid 60s. Yeah, the 64 was the Civil Rights Act, and then the 65 one was the Voting Rights Act. So there's something that's been passed around about Kirk, or a quote from him in here. And here's the one that's directly on that. The Civil Rights Act was a huge mistake. So again, they rate it as a correct attribution. Charlie Kirk once said, "We made a huge mistake when we passed the Civil Rights Act in the 1960s." So let's give the context here. So January 2024, in a Wired article, William Turton, the journalist, was interviewing Kirk, and Kirk made the statement while at America Fest, a Turning Point USA convention. And the audio verifies that he said it. So what is this law? This law is a federal law that was passed in 1964. Lyndon Johnson pushed this really hard. We know that Lyndon Johnson was a thoroughgoing racist in some of the most despicable ways, but he decided that it would get Black voters into the Democratic Party permanently, or at least for many, many decades, if they could do, if they could make the Democratic Party the party of racial justice. To talk on the left about the Republican plan to make the Republican Party the place where the Democratic, the Southern Democrats who were segregationists would feel more comfortable. But there was just as cynical a plan going on from the Democrats to try to get Black people to vote for them. And at least on the part of Lyndon Johnson, it was pretty cynical. He was a manipulator. And that's what he was doing in this particular case. But that's a completely independent question of whether what's in this Civil Rights Act in 1964 was good and necessary, right? That's a separate question from the motivations that Johnson had about it. It's widely considered a significant act. Honestly, some of the things in the Civil Rights Act of 1964 should not have been needed because the amendments passed in the US Constitution after the Civil War during Reconstruction should have gotten a lot of that stuff in there. But the reality is they didn't, in effect, get those things in there. And there were a lot of things that the Southern states were doing to try to get around those amendments. And this act 100 years later was an attempt to try to put into law some of the things that the courts had allowed to happen. There had been some movement overturning some of those things. For example, about a decade earlier, Brown v. Board with integrating schools and a number of other things. But the Congress decided that you could put some of these reforms into place in legislation that the Constitution had not in fact been protecting and get them in law. So some of them were that sort of thing. And some of them were things that went beyond what was in those amendments. But it was in combating things that the South had been doing. So it's that's kind of the history of the law and why the law has been seen as really important. It banned discrimination in public places, which was a common practice in the South. It provided for the integration of schools, which the 1953, I think, decision Brown v. Board already did, but it took. I mean, the schools weren't actually doing it. They famously they had to bring the National Guard in to enforce it at one point, right? They made employment discrimination illegal and things like that. So, how could you possibly think, unless you're an actual racist, right, that this law was terrible, right? That's the uh, the point of the memes that go around saying these things about what Charlie Kirk said. It seems like a pretty dumb thing to say if you actually are not a racist, right? Saying that the Civil Rights Act was a huge mistake. Why would he say something like that? Um, well, okay, that's other stuff. Yeah, so here's the exact quote. I have a very, very radical view on this, but I can defend it. And I've thought about it. We made a huge mistake when we passed the Civil Rights Act in the mid 1960s. So he says it. He very clearly did say it. Um, and he made the comment while responding to a question from a student who said he was the subject of a Title IX investigation. Same conversation as the one with Martin Luther King that we were just talking about. The student had posted a comment on social media about transgender people on social media. The Title IX investigation got him expelled from his college, and uh, that's the occasion where Kirk is saying we passed the Civil Rights Act in the mid '60s, and that's to blame. That's what he's saying here. So, what is he getting at here? um, uh, Here we go. Another quote from him. The Civil Rights Act created a beast, and that beast has now turned into an anti-white weapon. All right, now we can go back to this other article here. This one says, the bottom half of it says some things on this. How much? Some of this is just repeating things. No, that's back to the king. Yeah, they're just repeating their language. So, I mean, what's going on here? Why is Charlie Kirk saying this? I think it's really important to understand some of what's going on behind this. So, this is reflective of a general attitude on the right. They're, they're, it's more common on the right than on the left, I would say, and particularly among libertarians and people who are going to identify as conservative on race issues. What it goes to is a view of there's so many things tied up with this, but I have been recently reading work by a psychologist named Jonathan Haidt, Haidt. If you go to jonathanhaidt.com, or if you go to moralfoundations.org, or if you read his book, The Righteous Mind, you can get a sense of a little bit more on what's going on behind some of this and what I'm about to say. But Haidt has a very interesting set of research that he did. He looked at people's moral beliefs, and he identifies what he calls moral foundations. Moral foundations are basically things that you value and care about when you do moral analysis. And he identifies a bunch of different axes uh, of things you might care about. So, for example, one that is very common on the political left is the Care Harm Foundation. Uh, okay, so there's a lot more value placed on uh, issues like caring for people or avoiding harm coming to people on the political left. Does the right care about such things? They sure do. But do they elevate it to the same level? Like the left puts it up here, the right puts it a little bit lower, and the right has other ones that they put up a little higher that the left has way down at the bottom. Um, an example of another one that the left values pretty highly is equality. And a third one is liberty. Libertarians value liberty, but not the other two as much. But libertarians especially value a different one that the left doesn't value very much, and that's proportionality. Proportionality does very well on libertarians and conservatives. Liberty particularly does well among libertarians and liberals. Um, and then the care harm one is much higher for liberals than it is for libertarians or for conservatives. So this is just research that he did. He asked people questions of what they value, and then he asks them their political identification and tracks who does how well at which ones. So it's a really interesting thing. You can look at his site or you can get his book. There's a particular section of that book that's mostly about this stuff, The Righteous Mind. It's really good. There's a lot in that book that I think is less helpful and valuable for this kind of stuff, but there's a section of it around chapters like 5, 6, 7, 8, something like that, maybe 9. I'm not sure exactly precisely the boundaries of that, but it's identifiable as a section in the book. So I think it's highly worth reading. And on that website, one of the chapters is even there. You can just read it for free without getting that book. So uh, here's the thing. So when you look at issues like what traditionally has been called affirmative action, what people in more recent years were calling DEI, Kirk has things to say about that. Well, actually, this is going to help us look at the next thing as well. On the left, well, let's start with the right. On the right, I think it's it's easy to see what the left is doing in contrast to what the right is doing. So on the right, the way issues like affirmative action have historically been viewed is in terms of the proportionality uh, moral foundation, as Haidt describes it. So what does that mean? That means people get what they deserve. Now, there's a dark side to this, and there's a legitimate side to this. The dark side of this is making the assumption that whoever has the power must deserve it, right? That's the dark side to the proportionality thing. But that's not typically what well-meaning people mean when they oppose affirmative action. So um, what do they mean? They mean that they think people should be chosen for positions to be hired for or spots at a college campus in an incoming class of freshmen on some measurable qualifications. And that would be things like grades and SAT scores, so on. There's all sorts of intangible things that admissions offices look at, though. And it's not like you can really just say, this person does better on these numbers, and therefore this other person who didn't do as well on those got in anyway. There might be a number of things that they're looking at with that particular person. So I know that when I was accepted, they did one of the things in my application essay that really made the admissions office like me is that I said that I had raised chickens, and they thought that added to my interestingness as a person, right? So um, some of the things are kind of intangibles, but nevertheless, we have some measurable qualifications that we would look at. We might look at grades. We might look at SAT scores. Are they an athlete? Are they in a musical? Are they in clubs, right? Do they have other things that they're listing as their interests outside? Do they have a job, right? Did they have employment while they were in high school and so on? These are things that might be looked at and evaluate someone, right? So, I mean, when I try to get students to understand the proportionality uh, principle in philosophy, uh, one of the examples I use that you're all nodding along with every single time I say it. If you're trying to hire for a job, if there's one candidate who has a degree in the field, 20 years of experience, and good references, and there's another candidate who doesn't have the degree in that field, has never worked in that field, and doesn't have good references, it would be unjust to hire the second person. Justice requires hiring that first person. That's what people who are high on the proportionality foundation think. They think that justice requires uh, caring about these things. That person has earned this position and they deserve it, right? Now, I think that's false. I don't think that I have any obligation to hire someone with experience. I don't think I have any obligation to hire someone who has a degree in the field. I don't think I have any obligation to hire whoever I want. If I want to hire my nephew, I can hire my nephew, even if he doesn't know what he's doing, right? It's not a principle of justice, in my view, to do this. But I'm not high on the proportionality thing. I took the test. I'm really low on it. And the reason I'm really low on it is because it actually conflicts with Christian theology. We don't earn anything in Christian theology. We don't deserve any of the things that we get. Everything is mercy and grace. So I'm not in that mindset, but I understand that mindset. And here is a principle that I would agree with. Uh, the principle is that other things being equal, it probably is better to hire the person who's more qualified. And it probably is better to hire the person with more experience and so on. It's going to lead to better outcomes. I'm not a utilitarian. I'm not a consequentialist. I don't think consequences are the only thing that matters morally. I'm certainly not going to be an absolutist about that principle. Nevertheless, I think other things being equal, that is so. And that's even, I don't think it's about deserving in the same way that people high on proportionality do, because I don't think we even deserve the things that we get. That's just the plain teaching of Christian theology. Jesus tells the parable of the people who get hired at different times of the day. They're all promised this, the first group is promised a certain amount of money, and they're paid that certain amount of money, exactly what they agreed to work for. The later groups come in later in the day and work for not as many hours, and the owner pays them just as much. Did they earn that? No. All he said is he paid them a fair amount, or pay them what they pay them a reasonable amount. I can't remember what it says precisely, but like you can't follow the teaching of Jesus and think that it's only ever okay to some people might have worked longer and gotten the same pay, and it's not wrong to do that. And that, I mean, that's meant as a picture of Christian salvation, primarily. And people who come in a little bit later than others still get the full reward of life with God and the afterlife and all that. But uh, in traditional Christian theology, that is not earned. It is paid for by Jesus on the cross, right? So uh, I'm not an absolutist about this principle, but I do think this principle is good, and I think we should care about it. I think other things being equal, we probably should, in general, prioritize the people who have more qualifications. Other things are not always equal, and well, they're never always equal, really. But that's a principle that we should be paying attention to, sure. So but I think it gets absolutized on the right, among libertarians and a certain kind of conservative, and it doesn't have that absoluteness to it, in my view. So what's motivating the left on their contrary view, is that there are other moral concerns that matter. And one of those is, I mean, it's sort of the principles of retributive justice. This is what I've just been talking about. The proportionality principle often falls under retributive justice. People should get what they deserve, right? But at the same time, there's other things that we should care about that fall under the principle of justice, including the principle of distributive justice. Now, the right is very skeptical that there is such a thing as distributive justice. They don't think it's justice because they hear that and they think, we're going to take all the money from the rich people and give it to the poor who didn't earn it, right? That goes against proportionality, right? We shouldn't be doing things like that. That's stealing. One of the famous philosophical defenses of libertarianism by John Hospers argues that welfare programs are stealing and therefore they're immoral, right? But here's the principle that is distributive justice that I don't think any reasonable person can deny. Think about this kind of case. So suppose you have a bunch of decision makers and they make some decisions about some policy. It could be people who run a plant, it could be a government committee or something, right? There's people who make some decisions and they make some decisions that have a cost. That cost is significant, but the good that is being done outweighs the cost. If you just look at the pure numbers, the amount of good being done is more than the amount of harm being done. All right. Now, is that enough to know whether we should do it? Well, according to a traditional utilitarian, that is enough. We should do the thing. But there's more stuff that we should be looking at. And any person with any conscience will agree with me on this. I'm 100% sure of that. You don't have a real conscience if you don't agree with me on this. Uh, if the people who are making those decisions are making those decisions because they're the ones getting all the benefit, and there's some other group that has no say in the matter, that's getting all of the cost, Is it okay to make the decision that way? I think it's pretty obviously not as good, right? And you're the one who's getting all the good, and you're transferring all the harm to this other person who had no say in the matter, right? That's a classic case of oppression, right? That's not systemic oppression, but like the kind of oppression that historically everyone has believed in, right? Where someone is deliberately oppressing another group, right? That's right. I mean, isn't that what Hitler did? That's what Hitler was all about. Let's serve the German people, and yeah, it's going to come at the cost of marginalizing and wiping out the Jews and all that. But we care about us, right? And how is it any different than that, really, right? And what Hitler was doing was assuming all of his premises were true and more good would be done, right? It was still coming at the cost to a particular group of people. And that makes it wrong. It violates what utilitarians miss out on, what philosophers call deontological rights. Those groups' rights matter, right? And we can't just decide that because more good is being done for the majority group, some minority group is okay to try to mistreat, right? As I said, if you have any conscience at all, you should be opposed to this. What is that? That's a failure of distributive justice because you're distributing the good and the bad in ways that at all. So, yes, the right should care about distributive justice. It's really important as part of our conception of justice. You cannot just dismiss distributive justice, right? So there are failures of distributive justice that occur along race lines. That is indisputable at this point. I don't know how anyone can deny it. Uh, there were policies that were in place that have been removed that caused disparities along race lines, and those policies created conditions that still remain with us today. Redlining was a practice that involved housing discrimination, and particularly discrimination against giving loans to people from neighborhoods that were predominantly Black. That means that people who lived in those neighborhoods didn't have upward mobility. They couldn't buy a house and move out of those neighborhoods because people were discriminating against them because of their race. Well documented, obviously happened. No one really disputes that it happened, right? But the practice has been ended. Nevertheless, the people still live in those neighborhoods often because what's the do you expect everyone suddenly to move out of their neighborhood once they have the ability to do so, when they've got community built there and that's where they've always lived and so on. Um, Plus, there's all sorts of other factors going on that make it economically not so feasible to move sometimes, right? Uh, you have a wealth gap. But the neighborhoods, think about the neighborhoods. These are neighborhoods that are all rental properties. They're not owned properties. They're the people who live in them. They're duplexes or more. They have smaller driveways. They have, if they have off-street parking, it's a shared driveway, which you find in a lot of student neighborhoods. I have that in my neighborhood. But nevertheless, most Americans don't live in developments where there are shared driveways. They have their own driveway they can park in, right? But a disproportionate number of African Americans live in neighborhoods where they have shared driveways, where they have smaller roads, they have smaller backyards, smaller front yards, if they have yards at all. They don't live in neighborhoods where there are good grocery stores. There's a lot of dollar stores, which are or corner stores, which is less healthy food, and so on. There aren't medical facilities as close to them. Uh, there's all sorts of things, and there's a wealth gap. The income gap has narrowed quite a bit. The income gap is a lot less than it used to be. The college attendance gap and college graduation gap, very, very narrowed compared to what it used to be. But you would see in particular fields a still large disparity between the actual percentage of people in the population and their representation in those majors. And the wealth gap remains, even though the income gap does not. What's the difference? The income is how much money you make. Wealth is how much you have saved up, including how much you have in the property you own. And if you don't own a house, you don't have that, right? If you don't, if you, and wealth also includes the access to older family members who can help you out in the case of an emergency and things like that. Those gaps still remain, and that gap is a huge disparity along racial lines that still exists today, none of which requires anyone discriminating at all in the present moment, right? So um, if you're going to think along the oppressor-oppressed dynamic where systemic and structural factors can count as oppression, then this counts as oppression, right? On the traditional notion of oppression, it's not, because no one is actively seeking to harm it, right? Not anymore. And so you have this difference on whether that word is going to be used. Okay, sure. But do we want to see that as perfectly okay for our society to function in this way? I don't see how we could think that that's something that we should see as a good thing. That disparity exists and it's a bad thing. There shouldn't be such disparities along race lines, right? So, and you can go to area after area. I just gave one with housing, stuff in medical, there's stuff in nutrition, there's stuff in kinds of work that people do. There's lots and lots and lots of stuff within the justice system. Um, just excluding Black jurors for non-racial reasons, but then why is it that over a 10-year period, the same prosecutor has had all white juries in every single trial they've done, right? And they never face any consequences for it other than they have to do a retrial every time it gets discovered and at the higher level, right? But they still keep their job. It doesn't count on the level of withholding evidence, which they could lose their law license for. And yet it's unconstitutional. And the Supreme Court has said over and over and over again, if they do it, their case gets right. I mean, it's all sorts of stuff, all sorts of stuff. It's very, very clear that with all of other things being held equal, jurors are likely to give a death penalty more when the victim is white, more when the defendant is Black. And the data is absolutely clear on this. So is there something going on there? Yes. Are they deliberately discriminating? Probably not in most cases. Maybe there are those that are, but what more likely is an unconscious bias that people are more likely to identify with a victim more like them. More jurors are white, and there's probably more complications than just that. But and then in terms of the victim, yeah, there's a long history of portraying African Americans as animals. And does that affect stigmatizations and stereotypes? Do those have an unconscious effect on us? It's pretty clear research that shows that it has an effect on us. It has an effect on Black Americans just as much as it does on white. And does that affect conscious initial impressions of people? Does it affect police? Does it affect jurors? There's pretty good evidence that it does. Most people who don't want it to be true of themselves, when they discover this, are horrified. But it seems accurate once you look at the actual evidence, right? So there's all these things in place that are obstacles, that are disadvantages, that push people to the margins or push them downward in various ways. And I think it's just an accurate look. Those are parts of the structure and the system of American society. It's wishful thinking to think otherwise, really. Just the fact that we've changed some laws and people have better intentions than they used to. And I think that's true. We've come a long way. But nevertheless, there's these things that remain and they have a real effect. So what do we do about that? Well, the affirmative action idea, the DEI idea, is to say, look, there's these things that keep that yeah, they don't prevent someone from succeeding, but they're obstacles. Let's try to compensate for that one. But let's try to give people a little bit more chance than they would otherwise have if to engage in certain kinds of things, including college admissions, including hiring and jobs and so on. Most American presidents have been doing this several decades now. Most American presidents have been doing this in their cabinets. George W. Bush prided himself on having more diversity in his cabinet than Bill Clinton did, which he did. And Obama even more than Bush did. So that's true. Although once you get down to the levels below that, don't see as much of it, right? It's the top level positions that you started to see things like that. Was it wrong for Bush to hire Colin Powell as his Secretary of State? Was it wrong for him to hire Condoleezza Rice as his second one and as his national security advisor in his first one? Most conservatives will not say that that's wrong. Why? Because he wasn't lowering standards. They were eminently qualified for the job, right? And so most conservatives, there are people who would say, if you pay attention to their race, you're doing something wrong. But I think there's a really strong argument for paying attention to race. If he's got five candidates, but Colin Powell is one of them, and he thinks, I want to have a more diverse cabinet here. Here's someone who's eminently qualified. He'll provide a voice that has experiences and background that will provide something about America and Black America that I don't otherwise have in this room. That's a valuable thing to do. And Sonia Sotomayor said stuff like that when she was being interviewed by the Senate for her Supreme Court position. It was radically that she thought that somehow as a Latina woman, she would be a better judge, which is what she was saying. She was saying that having that experience would help her understand the cases that come in front of her and bring something to those cases that someone with different experiences might not have. We always talk about it's good to have prosecutors on the Supreme Court. It's good to have defense attorneys on the Supreme Court because it brings different experience to it, right? It's good to have law professors. It's good to have people with judicial experience, right? But it's also good to have people who have experiences of different segments of American life. That's what she was saying. And if you read the whole speech in context, that's what she was saying. They were badly misrepresenting her in a way that I think counts as false witness. They were lying. Now, maybe they weren't all lying. Maybe some of them were engaging in self-deception. But in any case, they were lying to themselves in that case, and that was also false witness. So, I mean, I think that moment was pretty awful. The Republican Party did not do very well on that occasion. And I still see people repeating things like that and not understanding what she was saying. It was pretty obvious to me what she was saying, and what she was saying was entirely correct. And I say that as a judicial conservative. I think Scalia and Thomas and Gorsuch and Barrett are better in the sense of my judicial philosophy than Sotomayor and Kagan and the new Justice Jackson. There was an earlier Justice Jackson a while back. I happen to think those are better justices in terms of their judicial philosophy for the most part. I disagree with them on significant occasions all the time, actually. But I do tend to think their overall philosophy is better in terms of how to decide cases. But what she was saying was not wrong. What she was saying was exactly right. So, and it's the same principle that is used in race consciousness in admissions. The principle is you've got a number of candidates who apply. One kind of race consciousness that can go on is, we got five people who can get this spot. One of them has an element of diversity to them that will provide a richness to our education environment because then people will be better. They did that with me with chickens. The fact that I raised chickens, they might do it with someone else with the fact that they come from a first generation immigrant family from Honduras, say, or Zaire or somewhere, right? Is that wrong? I don't think so. Again, I don't think that someone deserves that spot because they happen to have better numbers than someone else. I don't think that way of thinking is accurate morally. But even apart from that question, I think there's a what is the goal of a college and its admissions? To decide who they want there, right? Who they want there. What do they want their university, their college to be? They want it to be something that educates students, and they want it to be something that students who excel can learn. Now, obviously, some universities and colleges can attract those who look better on paper than others because of their reputation. And so they do have a goal of wanting it to be some of the better students that they can actually attract and get to go there. So that is why they should pay attention to grades, SAT scores, and so on. And they want people to graduate. They don't want to take people who aren't going to make it all the way through. That makes it look bad for them because they can't get their students to work through, and they don't want an attrition rate. They want a graduation rate that's higher, right? So it's in their interest to attract better students, sure. But I don't see how it's a moral obligation to take the one who has better numbers over the one that doesn't. I don't understand that thinking. It's not like someone deserves that spot, in my view. But even apart from that question, even if you think, yeah, there's these spots that get earned by the people who are better candidates, why can't you think that one thing that makes someone a better candidate, more deserving of that position, is that they bring something to the table that the other students don't bring? And why doesn't that count as a qualification? I think that can count as a qualification. So the question that remains is how much are you lowering your standards compared to the other students getting in? Are the students who are getting in way up here and the students who are getting in way down here, it's such that they're not going to do well, or they need so much extra support that it's not going to be the rest? Maybe they would be better off at a school on a lower tier, right? Or is it just, the numbers are close enough to each other that another qualification that pulls them up is fairly reasonable? And I mean, I have my experience on college campuses for over 20 years is that the biggest affirmative action that occurs on college campuses where you're lowering your standards significantly is the athletes. And particularly at the large university I teach at, it's the football team and the basketball team, the men's football team basketball team. All the other athletes are not like that. And many of the football players and basketball players are good students too. But those are the ones where I've seen them lowering standards. I even know of one case where somehow someone slipped through the cracks and was nearly illiterate. And the academic support people had to work overtime to try to get that person enough support so they can actually stay there because it was a star player. I mean, that's pretty embarrassing for that to have happened. They were lowering their standards pretty significantly, right? You don't see that at the same level with race admissions. Um, we had a Supreme Court case a couple of years ago that changed this, but the race kind of affirmative action that was occurring, sure, there were students coming in who were less prepared, and some of them were from demographics that receive affirmative action. That's certainly true. And they had support programs that allowed those students to get extra support and be able to get through and graduate. Um, so, but yeah, there's an argument out there on the right. This is not the deserving argument. This is a different argument that affirmative action policies do not actually serve the people they're intended to help. Is there a case that can be made for that? Yes, there is. That's a very different kind of argument. That's not the kind of argument that we're going to see in these Charlie Kirk things. He doesn't ever give those arguments that I've seen. Give those arguments, but that's a different kind of argument. The kind of argument he's giving is this proportionality deserving thing. So I think that argument is relatively easy to defeat as long as whatever you're looking at with the numbers, you might describe it as lowering your standards, right? But what you're really doing is you're thinking there's other standards than those ones, right? And those ones are bringing that person onto a similar level. But in the cases where there's a much bigger gap in the test scores and that would you would expect lead to more difficult out uh, uh, more difficult K through and earn their degree and so on. Those are the cases where I would worry about, but it's not because someone else deserved that spot. I don't think anyone deserved that spot. I think it's because it's not serving that student well to put them in an environment where they're struggling. So that's a very different argument and not the one that what we're seeing Charlie Kirk give here. So anyway, let's get back to the actual Kirk stuff. I think that was a significant digression away from the actual stuff that Kirk is saying here, but I think it's worth getting into all that to understand this whole discussion and to see where the right is coming from. And he's reflecting a lot of that. So why does he think that the Civil Rights Act created a beast and the beast has now turned into an anti-white weapon? Because he sees the Civil Rights Act as something that gave rise to a whole tradition, a whole movement in politics that led to this kind of affirmative action DAI kind of stuff that he thinks has become an anti-white weapon. That's what he's saying here, I think. I've said enough that undermines that whole viewpoint, I think. So I don't agree with what he's saying here. But what is he saying? Is he saying that the things that the Civil Rights Act were doing that was undoing Jim Crow were bad? No, that's not what he was saying. What he's saying is it gave rise to all this other stuff. That's the kind of uh, uh, narrative he's trying to spin here. Is it a narrative that I agree with? I agree with a few components of it, and I disagree with a large number of components of it. But at the same time, I don't think it's the same thing that people on the left have seen him saying this and assuming that he's saying. I don't think he's holding anything like that. I don't think he's getting at we should have kept Jim Crow. That's not what he's saying here. He's saying that there's stuff within this law that created the beast that has now turned into this anti-white weapon. And if we hadn't done that, we'd be better off. Is he ignoring the fact that there's all these good things in the law? Yes, he is. But some of the other comments I've seen from him about this have suggested to me that that's really what he's getting at. And I'm not going to go through any more because it's already getting long. I still want to get to the other stuff.